welcome. In this edition of India Revival Mission, we are going to discuss the state of the economy. I'm Hina Gambhir. 23.9% decline in India's GDP during April to June quarter was perhaps the worst in India's history. But the question is this unprecedented economic slump just an outcome of an act of God, that's coronavirus pandemic, or there is some other reason? Let's find out. We have with us today Abheek, Barua, Chief Economist at HDFC Bank, Gurcharan, author and former CEO, Procter & Gamble India, Sonal Varma, Chief Economist, Nomura for India and Asia excluding Japan, and R. Jagannathan, Editorial Director, Swarajya. Welcome to India Revival Mission, all of you. Let's begin this discussion with Mr. Gurcharan Das. What do you make of these numbers, sir? Minus 23.9%, bad, ugly?
Well, I mean, the reality is that, of course, we are in a great health emergency. So this is understandable. But we have to remember that we had a serious problem before the COVID struck. In other words, there was a slow quarter-to-quarter slowdown, which from 8% to 4.5% GDP. That was a huge, huge drop. And the reality is that there was a serious problem of demand. Ministers were asking industrialists, why aren't you hiring people, investing? And the industrialists said, but there's no demand. And so you had the NPMS, which was this twin balance sheet problem that we had, an overhang from the UPA days. But now, God, it's 10 years since that problem, and it's still not been sorted out. You had an unemployment crisis, and it's ironic that Mr. Modi got elected in 2014 to create those jobs. Vikas was a name for jobs. And we have not created those jobs. And you had stagnant exports. Exports have been stagnant since 2013. And finally, you didn't have the consistent reforms that we all expected from 2014. And in fact, the reforms have stopped since the Bajpayee government. Right from 90s was when we did the reforms. Now, you can't get growth, you can't get jobs, and without the reforms.
So you're trying to suggest that perhaps coronavirus pandemic perhaps has just accelerated the slowdown. Mr. Jagannathan, opposition, do you believe then is right in saying that demonetization, GST and lockdown were not master strokes but disaster strokes? What is your point of view?
See, I think that it's wrong to say that everything is because of COVID, and it's equally wrong to say that all the problems started in the previous few years were because of demonetization. Let's not forget the demonetization ended within 9 months when the economy was fully remonetized. And in the year after demonetization, we had our highest GDP growth numbers. So to say that now all the subsequent problems are because of demonetization, it's a little too much. I think the immediate disruptive impact of demonetization was obvious. But today to say that it was all be traced back to something in 2016 is ridiculous. Demonetization is over. In fact, if the digitization had not started in 2016, today's COVID pandemic would have been worse because if you see, there has been no financial disruption whatsoever. The entire banking system has shifted to digital mode. Individuals are paying through non-contact modes, through mobile wallets, through cards that do not need contacts. The entire digitization process that accelerated due to demonetization has actually helped us during COVID. So, and a few people sitting in RBI ensure that the entire payment system works brilliantly. Just imagine if you were dependent so much on cash and you were handling out 110 rupee notes to every single person you had to do a business with. You would have spread COVID 10 times faster. So let me be clear that trying to keep blaming demonetization for all our pleasant ills is wrong. Yes, we need to discuss a little further on that, but let's not give the donkey a bad name and then hang it. It's not right.
Okay, we need to now move on. Demonetization happened long back, 2016. It's over now. Talk about the current issues that are impacting the economy. Ms. Varma, where do you stand on as far as this debate is concerned?
Well, I think clearly the slowdown precedes the COVID shock, and the trend slowdown had been underway. I think actually, if you look at trends globally, there has been one, a slowdown in global growth, which has been responsible, and two, as Mr. Das was saying, we had a twin balance sheet problem involving corporates and the banking sector. And towards the end of 2018, we also had the NBFC problem, which basically made it a triple balance sheet problem. So all these factors together, global and domestic balance sheet issues, led to the trend slowdown. The COVID shock, of course, is clearly unprecedented, and the extent of damage we've seen this quarter is clearly because of COVID. But looking at the trends across different countries, India has actually been seen one of the worst economic contractions across Asia, Japan, which suggests that the lockdowns have been quite stringent. Vis-a-vis the actual fiscal support that has been offered is actually on the lower side. So I think, this is as things stand. But I think it's also important to sort of look forward. And, when we are sort of looking ahead, there are just two things I'd like to put on the table. One is, the pandemic itself. How do we resolve the after effects of the pandemic? And second, how do we reverse the trend growth slowdown that has been underway even prior to the pandemic?
Interesting and really important 2 points you've raised. We'll of course be discussing those as to what next from here on, because we need to now look ahead. What next after minus 23.9% in the first quarter? Mr. Abheek Barua, your opening comments on the state of the economy. What do the numbers tell you?
Yes, certainly. I think the plethora of problems that we had and which Mr. Das and Sonal have partially referred to did make us more vulnerable to the shock. I'm not going to speculate as to whether in the absence of these problems we would have contracted less or just contracted just as much because of the lockdown and so forth. I think it's worth our while to spend some time on understanding what this vulnerability actually led to. It certainly crimped our ability to respond to the shock and the extreme contraction in the economy that we saw in the first quarter. For instance, the lack of fiscal capacity has sort of been a huge problem in our ability to offset the impact of the virus. So yes, this is sort of a legacy of problems, which sort of one manifestation of which was a very tricky fiscal situation, is continuing to haunt us. But that said, I think, given the intensity of the impact of the virus and the kind of very dire economic situation that we find ourselves in, I think we'll have to rethink some of our, rather rigid views on what we should be doing on government spending, on the fiscal deficit and so forth. And while it is for an individual household a virtue to be parsimonious in the middle of a crisis, I don't think that sort of necessarily holds for a national economy. And I think I will go on like a broken record on the need for fiscal stimulus, and I think the government should at least partly jettison or dilute its concerns about rising public debt and so forth, and focus on providing fiscal, let me not call it just fiscal stimulus. I think it's a combination of fiscal relief, fiscal support, and finally fiscal stimulus. I think these are very critical. So that's what my opening comments would be.
Okay, so the sense that we get is that perhaps there is a need of another package. Ms. Varma, you also spoke about how there was low fiscal support. Do we need another big Atmanirbhar package as was announced in the past, the 20 lakh crore package? What should be the way out?
Yes, I think we do definitely need more fiscal support. And as Abheek was saying, it's not a stimulus, it's either a fiscal relief or a fiscal support. So those are two very different things. Now, why do we need additional fiscal support? What we are observing actually is that while, since the lockdowns have been relaxed, activity is normalizing. India is actually normalizing at a level which is still substantially below pre-pandemic levels. And there are a number of sectors which are significantly below their pre-pandemic levels, particularly the services-oriented sectors. So I think the extent, because it's going to be a prolonged period of subnormal activity, the extent of support broadly which is required by companies, specifically for sectors that are most affected by the pandemic, and also from the individual workers' point of view in order to protect the jobs, because if firms are under pressure for a long period of time, beyond a time they might actually move to firing workers. So I think in terms of more fiscal relief for firms as well as more job support, both urban and rural, is what is still necessary going forward.
Gurcharan Das, now August has brought some positive news as well. For example, the manufacturing PMI number, if you see, it has risen to a 6-month high of 52. The slump in power consumption has narrowed on a yearly basis in the month of August. India's largest car manufacturer has also shown a growth in sales by about 15%. Do you think these will ensure that government further gives us another package?
Well, I think personally the good news that this news that you're talking about really should translate itself into trying to bring the economy back to normal rather than, in other words, I feel if there's a stimulus, it should be very selective, hugely well targeted. But really the answer has to be based on the fact of some grounds. The real grounds for optimism today are that the oil prices are still low, and that's good for India. Forex reserves are at the highest, with over $500 billion. We have food self-sufficiency. And as Jagannathan pointed out, the digitization of the economy gives us a real advantage, especially the JAM trinity, Jan-Dhan Yojana accounts, mobile banking, and the Aadhaar. So the answer is growth, growth, growth. The answer is to create jobs, and jobs will create the demand that we need in the economy. I don't agree with the fact of printing money and giving away money to people. That's not the right way. Fix the financial system. Clean up that NPA mess. And the idea of combining good and bad banks is not a good idea. A better idea is to keep only 4 or 5 banks in the public sector and privatize the rest. Okay. And the most important of all is a crisis is the moment to do reforms. Reforms is the answer to jobs and demand creation. Okay. And we know those reforms are. So I won't go in and talk about it. But that is the answer.
So reforms is the answer to this problem of jobs. Mr. Jagannathan, in the last phase as well of this Atmanirbhar package that was being announced, we saw many big reforms being announced as well. Agriculture sector reforms in the space sector as well. So what more can we expect from the government? Because the people on the ground today are uncertain about their jobs. They do not want to spend money because they don't know if they'll get salary on the 30th or the 31st of the end of the month or not. So how will we boost demand? What can we do? Do you think it's a catch-22 situation for the government, Mr. Jagannathan?
See, I think there is no running away from the basic point that you need a short-term fiscal stimulus. It can't be an endless fiscal stimulus. So you need to put cash in the hands of people who are now refusing to spend. Okay. So that part, you see, the 20 lakh crore package was essentially more biased towards giving easier finance for companies when companies are unwilling to borrow so much, right? So there was no actual cash that went into things. Most of the benefits of the first package went in the form of kind in terms of free ration grains to the poor, which has been extended to November. So you do need a fiscal cash in the pockets kind of one-shot thing in the busy period of the economy, which begins from October. So now is the time to design it, or to in fact, we should deliver a second budget in October, so that in the busy season, you actually start on a fresh scale rather than an old budget was immediately negated. We presented the last budget in February. By March, that was irrelevant because of COVID, right? So it's a good time to shift the calendar year to January, December, present a new budget in October, which includes a fiscal stimulus and readjust the fiscal map. The second thing is, this government has done more reforms during the non-crisis period than almost any government since 1991. 1991 reformed due to a external bankruptcy. This time, without any bankruptcy, we actually did so many reforms. We had subsidy reforms, JAM reforms, bankruptcy reforms, GST reforms. Now the Essential Commodities Act is being modified. The APMC is going. We have even had labor market reforms. Our problem is not the lack of reforms. Our problem has been the sequencing and speed of reforms at a time when the India Inc. was unable to make use of them. So like if you say, okay, I'm going to give you ease of labor employment through fixed-term labor contracts and easing the Apprentices Act. But businesses is not taking on new labor because they have the double balance sheet problem where they're trying to pay back loans.
Yes.
There is no way you're going to create jobs. To modify Gurcharan Das' statement that we need growth, I will just put an asterisk and say we need the right kind of growth, That is, the quality of the growth matters, not the top line math, things like that. If you have growth can be led purely by capital infusions.
Okay.
But that is not going to create jobs. So you need to have the right kind of growth in sectors that actually create jobs.
If we actually talk about this new fiscal package that we are discussing here, that is the need of the hour, put cash in the hands of the people, in the pockets of the people, because they are worried right now. And with 83,000 cases coming on a daily basis, we don't know till when is this crisis going to be with us. So how should the government identify these kind of sectors?
No, I don't think the middle class necessarily needs cash transfers, but I think you can, for instance, like the UK or US did, support small businesses through wage support, through support for furloughs and so forth, and ensure that these jobs are retained and companies don't get desperate enough to actually ask people to leave, which is likely to happen is in the absence of either recovery or this kind of fiscal support. And I think we are kind of missing the gorilla in the room. I think sustained recovery can come only if we manage to get the disease under control. And clearly from the numbers that we are going and getting and the numbers that you referred to, the disease is certainly not coming under control. And not only is it not coming under control, it is getting increasingly dispersed across the country. And I just wonder if we are, Mr. Das talked about larger spending on health and education on a long-term basis. But I'm just wondering, and I'm really not very sure of what's happening on this front, but I'm just wondering if we are spending enough collectively, the central and state, to fight the disease. And one way of, bringing more transparency in the way the battle is being fought is to have a clear allocation to fighting COVID. This could be funded through special bonds. I've talked about COVID bonds in the past, and have a ring-fenced pool so that they can be used. It can be given to states. It can be used directly by the center in order to get the disease under control. I think that's critical to the recovery. In the absence, if we keep having these very high numbers, we are not going to get recovery. And this sort of trade-off between lives and livelihoods is a bit of a spurious trade-off. We just need to get COVID under control.
I think broadly all guests agree that we need some kind of a fiscal support from the government side. I would like to have closing comments from each one of you. Let's begin with you, Ms. Sonal Varma. What is your assessment? Because government is of the view that we are going to see a V-shaped recovery. However, many believe that it's not going to be a V-shaped recovery, but in fact an L-shaped recovery that's going to come for a country like India. What is your view? What is your projection for the next quarter and for the full year?
Yeah, 2 points, if you allow me. One is, I think at this stage, what we are seeing is normalization rather than recovery. Recovery starts when you normalize. I don't think we are at 100% of pre-pandemic yet. In terms of, growth for this year, we are expecting slightly over a 10% contraction in real GDP. The second thing I just wanted to also flag is, we have a short-term problem with the pandemic, and there's a longer-term problem in terms of reviving trend growth. Reforms are not going to resolve the pandemic-related issues, handling the pandemic is very different. So I think we need to be clear about the objective and the tools that we are using. The pandemic requires fiscal relief. It also requires handling the financial sector aftermath. The longer-term economic reforms are necessary to reverse the trend growth, which is where this entire value chain integration, infrastructure, etc. comes in. But we should not confuse the two. Those are two separate parallel strategies we need to adopt.
Mr. Gurcharan Das, your closing comments.
Well, I think we have to be careful that when we talk about fiscal stimulus, we say, look what America has done, look what Europe has done. But the reality is that we don't have the money.
Yes.
And printing money and giving it away is dangerous.
Mr. Jagannathan, what will you say in the end? Where are we headed? L-shaped, V-shaped recovery, your projection for the year?
I think we are more likely to be something like a W-shape. There is an immediate pent-up demand that will start meeting. So there will be a short-term revival. But the long-term revival, the other part of the W, depends on us doing the long-term things right and getting them in. And India has rightly not invested too much in fiscal support right now, but this is the time to do that. So we should worry less about the fiscal deficit for this fiscal year. From next year, yes, we should be back on the roadmap.
Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us here on this very special broadcast.